But remember the cost of empire. Here's where I'm slightly sympathetic to the British cause.
Yep.
Maybe I've watched Hamilton too many times, but the king is always, he is his own character. But I understand part of his argument is it's expensive to rule.
This is the Drive-By History podcast.
Today, I'm joined by Stockton University professor Dr. Michelle McDonald. Now, you'll meet Michelle in an upcoming episode of Drive-By History that took us to Batstow Village. All right, let's get to it. Michelle, I'm so glad you're able to join me today. I've been looking forward to talking with you more. You joined us for the Batstow episode, and we had a few discussions off camera, but I want to bring those to our audience and talk about it. So I'm thrilled that you can join me today.
I'm really pleased to join you as well. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So one of the things I'm always curious about with the historians that we talk to, what got you interested in history? I find it fascinating, but I'm not a college student.
Great question, because when I was a college student, I wasn't initially a history major. When I started at UCLA, I was a literature major, and I was for the first 2 years. Until it occurred to me that the courses I was enjoying most weren't the literature classes, they were the history classes. And so I started thinking more seriously about whether history could be my major. But if I had to pick a moment, I would say, and sometimes things happen because of serendipity, I saw a poster on a wall for a program called Education at Home, The Past is a Foreign Country. And it was a collaboration between the University of California system and Colonial Williamsburg, where they took California students and moved us to Virginia for a semester to introduce us to a different way of life. And that is what sealed the deal on becoming a history major and really set the trajectory for the rest of my professional life.
Wow. Now, I know that you grew up on the West Coast. I grew up on the West Coast. We don't have history that reaches back too far as European modern history is concerned. The town I grew up in was established in 1954, even though people were living there before it. Did you, like me, find it fascinating to come to the East Coast and suddenly there are things that are older than 100 years?
Absolutely. We do have older history in California, but it's really Spanish imperial history or indigenous history, right? And so moving to the East Coast, you really are, especially in certain cities. Philadelphia is one of them. You're surrounded by the 18th century. These are places that not only have the history, but they embrace and they commemorate that history now. So it was a very different way of thinking about early American history when I got here, because it is so present.
No, it absolutely is. And fortunately, they preserved a lot of the buildings. So you can still see you can see Betsy Ross's house, you can see Franklin's house, you can see a lot of those things. They're still there. Fortunately, not everything still exists, but a lot of it does. Now, I know that museum studies played a role in your background. We discussed that off camera. I'm curious how you got into museums.
This, in many ways, is the continuation of that story at Williamsburg. So when I was a history major, I was struggling a bit. So for those college students out there, struggling is okay. Struggling is normal. But I was struggling with what I was going to do when I graduated. I didn't know what a history major could do. I knew I didn't necessarily want to teach in the elementary school system. And it wasn't until I did that program in Williamsburg that it hit me. Museums were a viable career trajectory. So when I finished that program at Williamsburg, I enrolled in a master's program in museum studies and loved it. I am a very visual learner. I'm a very tactile learner. There's a great quote by Franklin that sums it up really well, that they had hung in the staff room in Williamsburg when I was down there. And it said, "If you tell me, I will forget. If you teach me, I will remember. But if you let me do it, I will understand." And museums are very much a place where history is done. It's also where history is taught, but can also be where history is done. And that kind of engagement was really attractive to me.
Which brings me to my next point. What is the role that museums play in teaching history? Because I think it's important as well.
I think it's extremely important. We think of history teaching as being a very traditional academic subject, but when you really step back, history is taught in so many places. And when you think about historic sites and museums, their audiences are so much broader and so much more diverse than a traditional history classroom can be. And so I think it's extremely important. It used to be that academic history and public history were seen as really distinct fields. That began changing a few decades ago, and I think there's much more respect and recognition in academic history of the value of teaching history through museums and other public sites. It continues to be a major way in which I think about history teaching, even in my classrooms, and I've certainly continued to partner with museums even as an academic.
What do you think was the catalyst for changing that relationship?
One of the big catalysts was out of necessity. I'll give you a very small history lesson.
Okay.
Part of this was there was a dearth of academic history posts in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In other words, there were fewer jobs than there were people graduating with advanced degrees in history. And for the first time, you saw academically trained people with master's degrees and doctorates moving into museums. And all of a sudden you start to see this kind of work as being academically viable, but more important, at the same time, you also see, I think, a deeper engagement with research happening in museums and public history sites. And so these kinds of what had been very different fields began to have language to talk to each other. And so since that point on, really since the 1970s, there's been an increasing embrace and cross between what was considered classical history training and public history training. So there's a lot more collaboration than there used to be.
Well, that's great, because obviously both institutions benefit from it.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic.
Absolutely.
So I know you worked in the classroom, you worked on the administrative side. We talked at length about the fact that you went from the classroom into administration, and now you're back in the classroom. I'm curious about that journey, things you learned along the way, some things you're proudest of. Just give us a little overview.
Sure. So I started as a faculty member in 2006 now. And taught for about 7 to 8 years and really enjoyed it, and taught both early American history, early Atlantic history, which we'll get to in just a minute, I think, and then public history and museum studies. And I loved it. But after I got tenure, I had a crossroads. It's kind of similar in the way we have these moments, forks in our lives, where we make choices. When I was in Williamsburg, I was deciding between regular teaching and museums. When I got tenure, I was deciding between staying in the classroom, which I enjoyed very much, or thinking about administration. Administration is a very different way of contributing to higher education. But it was the route that I chose to take, and I did that for about 8 years. And I loved it. It took me further afield from history, but it allowed me to do other things. So if you ask me, what am I proudest of as an administrator?
Yeah.
And I'll go back to faculty. What I'm proudest of as an administrator is making college education more affordable. A lot of the programs that I focused on, developing scholarship programs, thinking about ways to make stronger bridges between 2-year community college institutions and 4-year institutions. We're all geared towards making a 4-year college or university experience available to more students and a much more diverse range of students. That is by far my greatest accomplishment and what I'm proudest of.
Yeah, I tip my hat to you on that one. I know students benefit from that like crazy. New Jersey has a wonderful program, a feeder system through the community colleges into the 4-year universities. That's wonderful. Yeah.
The Garden State Guarantee. Yep.
Yeah, that's fantastic. How about the classroom? What are you proud of in the classroom?
I'll give you 2 examples.
Okay.
Number one, so the university where I teach is only an hour from Philadelphia, yet I was surprised on a regular basis how many of my students had never been, or if they had never been to museums. So I worked hard to create classroom experiences that brought students to, to the President's House or to the Constitution Center or to Elfress Alley or to some of the libraries and museums that we have. You think about the Library Company or the American Philosophical Society or the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. We're so close to these amazing resources that support the study of history, but students don't necessarily know how to enter those arenas unless they're introduced to them. So that's one way, but I'll give you one more. One of my favorite classes of all time was a class I taught called Comparative Slavery and Emancipation.
Okay.
And I taught that class because I think students are so used to thinking of slavery as being a North American phenomenon, a United States problem, but in fact, it was much larger. And so I would start that class by asking my students, when I ask you to think about enslavement, what do you think about? And I would get answers like the Underground Railroad or the Cotton Gin or Harriet Tubman or the Emancipation Proclamation, or any one of a number of answers, all of which I said were not incorrect, but really limited their study to North America and to about 1790 to 1865. So it was a very circumscribed history. This class looked at how slavery worked throughout the Atlantic world, in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, in Europe, in West Africa, in North America. And so at the end of that semester, I would ask my students again, now, when I ask, what do you know about the system of enslavement? What comes to mind? And they would fill the chalkboard from end to end. And it was one of those moments when I could then step back and look at them and say, my work for this semester, at least, is done. It was a chance to really open their eyes. That's what I look forward to as a faculty member, changing how students think.
But incredibly impactful. And I have to be honest, growing up on the West Coast, because so much of our area really was developed post-emancipation. What I learned about slavery was that it was a Southern U.S. phenomenon. And coming here, doing the show, going to Sylvester Island, learning about some of the plantations that were in the North completely opened my eyes. That there were, slave trading posts that were in New York City, in Philadelphia, in Trenton. It's not something we think of, but yeah, it really opened my eyes. And also to the global slave trade. It was not U.S. based at all.
Not at all.
I would have loved your class.
It was a great class. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. All right. One of the things that we talked about when we were together is your connection to the Caribbean. Very curious if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. This in many ways links back to that class. That's what inspired that class. So my own research, which is in the coffee trade, and how coffee demonstrates relationships between North America, what becomes the United States, and the West Indies, required that I do an extensive amount of research in the Caribbean. So I lived in Jamaica for a year and a half, and lived in Dominica for several months. Those were the two places where I did the most research. We are so used, that is to say North Americans, are so used to thinking of the United States or North America within isolation. It's not our fault. It's how we're taught. I think history in the K-12 system, and even in the early American surveys in most colleges and universities. But North America was anything but isolated in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was part of the British imperial system. One of my favorite ways to drive this home in the classroom is to say in 1776, there were 26 colonies. British colonies in the Americas. 13 of them decided to seek independence, and 13 of them did not.
Correct.
Why? Why would North America's colonies, and it took some persuading of some of those colonies, why would 13 colonies choose to revolt and 13 colonies choose to remain within the empire? And the answer has everything to do with where they were located, what kinds of defense they needed, what their economies were like. The other 13 colonies were all based in the Caribbean, right? And they relied on Britain for maritime support against French and Spanish colonies that weren't, I realize we think they're close in Florida and Louisiana. They're not as close as the next island over where you can see them on the horizon.
Right. Right.
They were economically far more dependent on the empire for importing everything from food to clothing to wood to building materials. So there's lots of good reasons why those two sets of colonies took different steps. But it's important to think about the Caribbean as part of the Americas. I get a little frustrated, not frustrated. But I do make a point of reminding my students on a regular basis that you can't use the word America as synonymous with the United States. There are the Americas,
Correct.
Which includes North America, not just the United States, also Canada, Central and South America, and Mexico, Central America, South America, and the West and the Caribbean nations, which are all part of the Americas. Sometimes we privilege U.S. history. It's important to remember that we're part of the system. We were then, we still are.
No, my father was born in Mexico City. So believe me, I grew up being told, no, you're not American. You're from the United States. You were born in the United States. We're all American. Yes. Canada as well. Absolutely. And South America. It's all part of the Americas. It's funny, but yeah, I've had that argument with friends over the years. It's like, they're not interchangeable. So it's a really important point. You brought up something I'm very curious to loop back around to, though. A lot of people have a misperception about the U.S. economy at the time that we started. If you want to name 1776 as the year when things really changed, there was obviously an economy growing before that, but it was heavily dependent on goods being brought over from Europe primarily, and obviously the Caribbean, as we were just discussing. Rich Veit, who's one of the professors we work with regularly, I went on a dig site with him and he found this little piece of yellow brick and he said, oh, this was brought over by the Dutch. Why would you bring a brick over? It's so heavy. And he goes, they didn't have the resources here. We have this sense that they came here, exploited the resources. There was timber to be had. There was iron ore. There was coal. Well, that didn't happen in a day. Can you talk a little bit about what the economy looked like in the late 1700s?
Sure. So there were certain areas, certain economies that did grow. We did have natural resources. Timber is a really good example. The cod fishing industry is another great example. But it's important to remember that those industries, while not quite as focused and extractive as, say, the sugar economy of the Caribbean, were still very much geared outward, not inward. We cut a lot of wood that we shipped overseas. We caught a lot of fish and salted it primarily to create a protein source for enslaved people in the Caribbean. These were trade patterns that linked us, that bound us inside the empire. Another way of demonstrating it, in a nice, easy shorthand, is if trade were not so important, we brought in goods too. If trade were not so important to the U.S. economy, then why did the increasing taxation of import goods in the 1760s, rather, and 1770s, cause so much consternation? It's because these were goods we were not producing ourselves. Paper goods, ceramic goods, metalwares, sugar. These were things that we were importing. And Britain was taxing them to pay primarily for debt because of the 7 Years' War, but they were taxing them because they were bringing them to us. We didn't make them ourselves.
Right. And from what I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a huge push to bring over settlers from Europe to establish communities here, wanting them to live independently, but at the same time be completely reliant on those goods that are being brought in. So it was a catch-22 for those folks. You got me to come here. I'm trying my best. It's not necessarily a friendly environment to be in, especially in the earlier days, but you're taxing me at the same time. So you're penalizing me for actually doing what you wanted me to do.
It's true. But remember the cost of empire. Here's where I'm slightly sympathetic to the British cause. Maybe I've watched Hamilton too many times, but the king is always, he is his own character, but I understand part of his argument is it's expensive to rule. And so at the end of the 7 Years' War in particular, Britain had invested a huge amount in colonial defense against indigenous peoples and the French, and there was a mounting debt. And so the decision was to do two things. One was to impose some new legislation and taxes. But as I also remind my students, in some cases, it was simply enforcing what was already on the books and had become a bit lax. Now, a tax is a tax is a tax. You're not going to like it whether it was something you were supposed to pay and hadn't been, or now newly had to pay. Either way, you were being asked to pay. But it was a system of government that, you're right. On the one hand, it was part of an empire, but it had been allowed to develop a sense of autonomy. And local governance that then began to jar when imperial law was being reimposed.
Well, we talked about it at length in an upcoming episode on New Sweden, and how the Swedes and the Finns were brought over, and they were really encouraged to build a sense of community here, establish roots, create family lines that would feel like, but at the same time be reliant on European goods that were coming over. And anyway, it's something I'm sure our audience will, when they see that episode, will get a better sense of it. But I just found it fascinating because I think far too many people just have this sense that we came over here, we started cutting down trees, we built log cabins, we lived great, we farmed, built this economy, and suddenly New York City's here a couple hundred years later.
Right. No, it took a little more than that. A lot more. Yeah, a lot more than that. And even after independence, honestly, there was a huge struggle. There's a reason why it takes as long as it does to pass the Constitution. And even after that, the battles continue between where governance should lie. Yes. I mean, I won't talk politics for long, but I will say, as we're moving into an election year, one of the biggest challenges of the late 1770s and the early 1780s is this question of how strong a central government should be. We had just fought to leave a system that we thought didn't represent us because it was too strong at the central level. And so this whole conversation about local governance versus a more central federal governance that candidly still resonates today, that conversation was loud and strong as the American Revolution was winding down and we had the first few years of independence.
Right. And isn't it interesting? We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and we're still having this conversation.
We are.
I guess it means that we're a thriving thriving country because we're still talking about it.
That's true. And we're still using at our base the documents that were framed in the 18th century. So.
Right. But we have to look at them again and with modern eyes as well. Yes, that's why historians are so important, because you give us a sense of how to interpret these things.
I appreciate that. And I agree.
Yes, absolutely. So you brought up coffee, which is one of my favorite topics on the planet, because I can't live a day without it. So many of us. Let's talk about the coffee house culture that was going on in the 1700s. I know I read your article, so I have a little insight here, but I'd love it if you talk a little bit about it for our audience.
Sure. I got into coffee when I was a graduate student. And partly that was because I have this history of starting in one field and moving to another. When I started graduate school, I was really interested in the history of public education in the United States in the 19th century. But I took a course on Caribbean history. And I took a course at the same time on early modern British history. And it occurred to me as I was reading for both of these classes that one was talking about where coffee came from, predominantly the Caribbean at that point for the British Empire, Jamaica in particular. And one other set of readings and discussions were all happening about coffee consumption and the development of coffee houses and how they served as places of social currency, conversation, political discussion, trade. But rarely did these conversations intersect. It was almost as if the coffee was produced and then it left the islands, and then that story was over. And here the coffee appeared and people were drinking it, and there was no discussion about where it came from. And so I really was interested in how do commodities move from places of production to shape the communities that consume them. And that's where my real interest in coffee and coffee houses came from. But coffee houses are these fascinating organizations. They were, in some ways, they were like taverns. They served food. They might have overnight accommodation or stabling, but in other ways, they were really different. They were our post offices before we had a postal system. They were our banks in many ways. There were currency exchange days where you could determine what the value of different monies were from different parts of the empire or different empires. They were our custom houses. They're where you might book transportation abroad or find out whether you could send your barrels on this ship or this ship. They served this immense economic and social function in colonial societies, both in England and most definitely in North America and the Caribbean.
How did they differ from taverns, though? Because this is one of the things that you talked about in your article. Because we think of tavern culture as being the predominant, that's where people come together, they drink together, they eat, they can stay there, you can rent a hotel room or whatever the equivalent at the time, if you're traveling from one town to another, which was much slower and took a lot longer then. Yeah, so what was the difference? Yeah.
I would say, if I was going to shorthand it, I would say that taverns were social institutions. They were part of their community, but they were primarily geared for, you just nailed it on the head, for travelers, for people who were coming through, for people who needed accommodation or who needed meals or who were traveling from one point to another. Coffee houses were predominantly for the communities in which they operated. They served as trading houses. They served, again, as currency exchange places. They served during the American Revolution as rallying places. And there's no coincidence that coffee houses became the places where merchants gathered to protest against taxes, to launch local efforts to at non-importation, to bring up captains or shopkeepers who still imported goods that we were supposed to be banning because we were protesting taxes. Coffee houses were institutions of their communities, and they served those members rather than the people who were passing through.
Interesting. And it's interesting to me that even today, we always say, let's meet for coffee. Let's go meet at the local coffee shop, whether it's a mom and pop shop or a big chain. But that's where we sit, and you sit for hours and discuss. I've had business meetings in coffee shops. I mean, that's just what we do today. Really.
They are political discussions, lectures, all of those things still happen in coffee shops.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. But yes, I really enjoyed your article, and I suggest anyone out there, look it up. You'll find some really interesting information there. One of the other things we talked about when we were together was revising curriculum, working very strongly to very efficiently, or really trying hard to make sure the curriculum represented what students needed and presented the information correctly. So I'll let you address how you approach that.
No, it's a great question. And in some ways, I benefit from this because I had that 8-year, I was going to say disruption, but that sounds bad. This 8-year transition so I was in the classroom and then administration and then the classroom again. And this semester, for example, I'm teaching the colonial North America class. So North American history to 1789. The last time I taught this class was in the fall of 2010. Wow. A lot has changed in 13 years in terms of how we think about North American history and where we start and where we end and what we emphasize. So when I looked at my 2010 syllabus, I think I had, because I'm an Atlantic historian who has always been interested in the Caribbean, I did have at least a week where I was discussing about early migration across the Atlantic and the indigenous people who lived here, but it was really only a week before I moved into Jamestown. This year, Jamestown didn't hit until week 4. There were 3 additional weeks that were talking about what were the push and pull factors in Europe, what was happening in earlier colonization efforts in West Africa, how did that inspire people to move across the Atlantic, what happens in Central and South America before there really is any exploration or thoughts about settling and colonizing North America. All of that is a precursor, and it's important because it re-emphasizes this idea that what happens in North America does not happen only in North America. It's part of a much larger chronology. So thinking about how you start a class, what stories you choose to emphasize. I'll give you one other example. This was a fun class. So I did teach Jamestown. You do need to teach Jamestown when you're teaching colonial American history. But instead of just teaching Jamestown as the first permanent settlement of Britain in North America, I had students read alongside their textbook the opening introduction to Nicole Hannah-Jones's The 1619 Project. Now, what's interesting to me, and I do like the project, I realize there's a lot of conversation about it, but I think the project makes a really core and important contribution to rethinking what are the traditional parameters of U.S. history. But she only has a paragraph on 1619. And I thought, why is it called the 1619 Project when only so much time is spent on 1619? So I asked my students, based on what you know about 1619, and there's some great research about early colonists, about the early free African American community, about the introduction of enslavement in 1619, into how would her argument have been stronger if she included more information about the 1619 experience from various perspectives. And that was a great way to teach that class, and something I would never have thought of doing 13 years ago when I was teaching the same segment.
Is this something your students are spending a lot of time thinking about too? Because it's certainly in the news all the time.
I think some students had heard of 1619,
Okay.
Not all of them had. But I do think that there's definitely interest among students to have a more diverse approach to understanding history more generally. And part of that is that the nature of our student body itself is diversifying. The fastest growing segment of my campus's student body is Hispanic by far. So there's a real interest, and then there is also a strong African American component. So there's a real interest in understanding the perspectives other than what has traditionally been the majority perspective in history, and I think it's really exciting. There's also a real interest in Indigenous history that is new, that was not nearly as strong, again, 13 years ago when I was teaching. So the students are asking for it, and I think the students are better for understanding it and being willing to engage with it, because it historians like to say it's a joke. When you ask a historian anything, you can almost always predict that the first part of their answer will be, well, it's complicated. And then they'll wonder a response. But the fact of the matter is, it is complicated. And so introducing that history can be challenging and messy and not always filled with resolution is really important for helping students understand, because the world around them right now looks messy and complicated. It's not as if everything was so much easier back then. So let's not put a tidy bow on it. Let's explore that messiness and what it means.
But I love what you're saying, because history is not static.
Right.
It is always evolving, and we think, well, the date can't change, but how we look at the date, how we interpret the circumstances surrounding it. I had a conversation with another historian on the podcast about the fact that you all have so much more at your fingertips now because of the internet. You're able to access records across the world in a second, rather than having to travel someplace to look in a library and dig through volumes and maybe come across something. So I think that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that the interpretation is evolving faster now than it has in the past.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It used to be when I first started teaching in 2006, that I would envy those who were working on 19th or 20th century material because their material was so much more readily available than mine was. I can't say that anymore. There's incredible access to material that there simply wasn't when I was in graduate school or when I was a junior academic. That is both a blessing and a curse, of course, because it means there's so much more to review.
Somebody else pointed that out too. It's like, now we're inundated with information.
Right. But it does mean that that accessibility is fantastic. And it's not just accessible to faculty, but it can be accessible to students as well. There's wonderful digital databases that look at early American newspapers or political pamphlets, even visual material, political cartoons that allow students to really engage with primary source material, because at the end of the day, that's what you want. You want to teach students. My goal, history has two meanings, right? History is both a subject and a discipline. My goal is, it's not that I'm not interested in history, the subject. Clearly I am, but I'm much more interested in history, the discipline. I want students to learn how to think, how to analyze, how to revise their opinions, how to expand their opinions. That's the part of history that really excites me. The subject matter is what they use in that process, but it's the process, I think, that's really crucial to engage in the classroom.
That ability to think critically is a life lesson we can all benefit from.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, far too many don't ever learn it.
I know. But there's hope.
Yeah,
one student at a time.
You're doing your part to get it
Exactly.
to happen. It was interesting. I was told by another historian that I talked to, one of the hardest things for her was to be in a room full of older historians who all have very set ideas. And she's like, but the research now doesn't support what you're positing.
Right.
And we have to evolve, and there's a resistance.
There can be. I mean, I'm fortunate where I am. I'm probably right around in the middle of where we are in terms of age and experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we have a really engaged and dynamic faculty that collectively think about history as an evolving experience. We require all of our students to take a course called the Introduction to the Study of History, which looks at how the questions historians ask and the subject matter that we're interested in evolve over time, because that helps to explain why some questions are taken up in some decades and not in others, and which questions had yet to really be taken up. And so, you can look at things like, why were people so interested in political history during a time period? And then when did it switch to economic history? And then when did we become really interested in gender? And then when did the study of race really begin to blossom? And then comparative, like Atlantic or regional histories. So the history itself, the subject matter, changes based on how the questions we ask, and the level, the kinds of interest we bring to it, and to some extent the backgrounds of the historians who are doing that work, who bring our own conscious and unconscious biases to what we're doing. I don't mean that in a bad way. We all have our own unconscious
It's part of being human. Absolutely.
Yeah. But it does mean that the field is dynamic, not at all static.
Right. And I agree with you 100%. I'm curious, as we approach the 250th, what do you think are the areas we should really be focusing on going forward? It's an inflection point, maybe, or is it just a date that we're going to mark and move on?
I hope it's an inflection point.
I do too.
I really do. We don't use dates like this are few and far between. We're not going to have another one of, I mean, yes, of course, you can always start the Declaration of Independence on its 251st or its 257th or its 372nd. But 250th is a moment.
Yep.
It will be a national moment. Hopefully it will be a global moment of reflection. And it can be a real opportunity. This is going to be a challenge. It can be both. I like to think it can be both. A moment of commemoration, marking where we are and what we've accomplished as a nation, but also a moment of reconsideration. There always were people who were left out of the experiment of 1776. We have made, in some respects, tremendous strides in re-engaging those groups that have been marginalized, but there is so much work still to do. And I think recognizing that there were groups left out in 1776 doesn't diminish the importance of that time period and of the documents that emerged from it. But I do think we need to recognize that those political leaders who framed those documents that shaped our early nation were human. They were operating within a context and a time period. They weren't able to operate unilaterally. There was compromise after compromise. They're easy to find. Look at your historical documents. It'll be the blank, blank compromise. It's called compromise for a reason. And so considering what choices were made then, I think can help us understand that we're still making choices now. That's going to be challenging. This is a very political, polarized nation at the moment.
I mean, it's coming at a time when we are incredibly polarized.
Yeah. But I'd love to see 2026 be a moment of real self-awareness and examination and celebration. There is a moment to celebrate. But it needs to be a celebration that's tempered by a recognition that not everyone is going to see the state in the same way.
Right.
They won't.
Right. No, I think it's a very important point to keep in mind. Okay, let's move on to something a little lighter. Let's talk about one of your passion projects. What is Mud Girls Studios?
Mud Girls is a passion project. Mud Girls has nothing to do with history. Mud Girls Studios.
I had a feeling it's something you get to do fun. Yeah.
It is. Mud Girls Studios is a nonprofit based in Atlantic City. that helps women who are recovering from a range of really challenging circumstances. So these are women who might be recovering from addiction or homelessness, or beyond parole, or chronically under or unemployed. There's lots and lots of challenges that these women face on a regular basis. And so 6 years ago, I guess there's a small history connection. 6 years ago, a wonderful woman who is the spouse of another faculty member in my history department, there was a connection. Herself, an artist and graphic designer, founded this nonprofit. And since then, she has had, I think, 30 women go through. It's a 6-week job training program that teaches them to work with clay, right? Clay to make, it's a fantastic experience. Clay to make both decorative objects, so think of your holiday ornaments, but also larger objects like platters and pitchers and cups and mugs and anything you can make with clay, vases, anything you can make with clay, as well as these incredible massive tile installations. They exist all over Atlantic City and some in New Brunswick, they do several things. This is the way I think of it. They teach women fundamental skills that you need in employment, right? When to arrive, how to work as a team, how to problem solve, how to budget. But they also teach them a lot about themselves. These are women, again, who are coming from really difficult circumstances. None of them, I would guarantee you that none of them walk into that studios thinking I'm an artist, thinking I'm creative, thinking I have the capacity to make something beautiful. All of them leave that studio knowing those things. And that is an amazing transformation to watch. So Mud Girls is an amazing group. I've been on their advisory committee for 2 years. I work as their volunteer grant writer and try to get them more money so they can open a larger studio and employ more women and create a retail store. But it's a passion. It is a passion with purpose that I am deeply committed to.
I love that. Is there a way that our audience can help support this project?
You can. If you mudgirlstudios.org, if you just Google Mud Girl Studios Atlantic City, it will come right up. It will tell you their mission. It will tell you where they're located. They do have an online retail store. They also do a series of special events, many of them, in fact, hosted by historic sites and museums. So we can connect our initial love with this love and go see Mud Girls in person. So yeah, if anyone watching wants to Google Mud Girls Atlantic City, Mud Girl Studios Atlantic City, you will see an amazing operation in play.
I think it's important to support this work that you're doing. I just think it's fantastic. And I'm really glad that you're part of that. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Thank you. And thank you for letting me share it. I appreciate it.
Of course. No, I want to support the things that you guys are involved in as well. You are so wonderful to come support Drive by History. Of course, we all have our passion projects. And Drive by History is my passion project, which means I get to talk to amazing historians all the time. That's my fun. So absolutely. Anything I can do to help the things that you're doing on the outside, 100%.
I appreciate it.
Curious, do you have any articles coming up, any books coming up? Is there anything you're watching for from other people that you can't wait to be published?
Oh, there are many, but I will do a shameless plug. So I am finishing up a book which coming out through the University of Pennsylvania Press called Caffeine Dependence.
You wrote it about me, I can tell.
It's clever. Caffeine Dependence, Coffee. Well, the boring title potentially is Coffee and the Caffeine Dependence, Coffee and the Economy of Early America. The catchier title, which I'm hoping the publisher will accept, is Caffeine Dependence. That one's staying. How coffee became how coffee became North America's drink. And it really is. It's a good story. It really is a story that challenges some of what we think about the American Revolution. So it's timely coming up for 2026. We think of 1776 as this moment of rupture where we leave the British Empire and move toward this sense of building a nation. What I argue, coffee, which had been a trade good since the early 18th century, really. Earlier than that in West Africa and in Europe, certainly, and in the Middle East. But in terms of the Americas, it arrives in the first quarter of the 18th century. But the United States, doesn't really become a major trader in coffee until the closing decade of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century. But by the 1830s, when most of the coffee production has shifted to Brazil, I'll start wrapping the story up. It's a long one.
No, it's good. It's good. I'm fascinated.
The United States has become one of the largest shippers of coffee around the world. Indeed, we are still one of the largest shippers of coffee around the world.
Wow.
The fun part is we were shipping other people's coffee. We don't produce coffee.
That was going to be my next question, because we're not a coffee producer. Yeah.
No, the only places where we ever produced coffee were when we annexed Puerto Rico and Hawaii. And Guam for a while. We produced coffee there. And there are, in fact, if you look in the 19th century records of coffee companies, it's actually very reminiscent of some current marketing strategies where they're producing coffee from our own nation and trying to, bill it as a national product. But instead, what most of the coffee we transship do, we do make it American, but not because we grow it, because we process it and package it. And so coffee becomes American, I argue, when it moves through the coffee processing and marketing process and is reshipped around the world as Maxwell House or as Standard Coffee or as Folgers. But the coffee we're shipping isn't something we produce. That's why it's caffeine dependence. It becomes one of the largest markets for the United States in terms of income in the 19th century. And we depend on other nations to produce what we sell.
So it's not just about the jitters when I don't have my coffee?
No, it's not. It's all about a global story. It's a whole
No, that's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to read it. When is the book going to be out? No pressure.
No. It's going in the best of all possible worlds. It's going into copy editing next month. So we're hoping by December 2024, about a year from now.
That would make a great holiday present.
Just in time. Exactly.
I suggest everybody get a copy. No, that's fascinating. And I love the play on the title. That's really clever.
Thank you.
And I hope they let you do the more fun subtitles.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think it'll have a more popular appeal, but we'll see.
Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with us today. I know our audience really enjoyed it as well, I'm sure.